The morning sun cast long shadows across the ceremonial grounds as thousands of spectators gathered behind velvet ropes, their cameras ready to capture what was supposed to be a peaceful display of international cooperation. The annual Freedom Day parade had drawn visitors from across the globe, with military units from 12 nations preparing to march in perfect formation through the historic city center. Captain James Morrison adjusted his dress uniform one final time, the morning breeze catching the stars and stripes that adorned his sleeve. As a decorated Marine with 3 tours of duty behind him, he had participated in dozens of ceremonial events, but today felt different. The tension in the air was almost tangible, though he couldn't quite pinpoint why. Perhaps it was the increased security presence, or maybe the way the local officials kept glancing nervously at their watches. Standing at attention with his unit, Morrison surveyed the scene before him. The parade route stretched for nearly 2 miles through the heart of the city, lined with historic buildings that had witnessed centuries of political upheaval. Today, they would witness something unprecedented, though none of the thousands of participants and spectators could have predicted what was about to unfold. 300 yards away, Sergeant William Thornfield of the Royal Guard stood motionless in his scarlet tunic, the morning light reflecting off the polished brass buttons that ran down his chest in 2 perfect rows. His bearskin cap sat precisely positioned, and his ceremonial rifle remained at the perfect angle across his chest. Thornfield had served in the Royal Guard for 8 years, participating in state funerals, royal weddings, and countless ceremonial duties. His reputation for discipline and attention to detail was legendary among his peers. The crowd continued to grow, with families finding spots along the parade route, children perched on their parents' shoulders for a better view. Street vendors moved through the throng, selling miniature flags and commemorative programs. The atmosphere should have been festive, but seasoned security personnel noticed subtle signs of unease. Radio chatter had increased throughout the morning, and several unmarked vehicles had taken positions at key intersections. Behind the scenes, coordination between various security agencies had become increasingly complex. The presence of international military units required careful planning and multiple layers of oversight. Each participating nation had brought their own security protocols, creating a web of jurisdictions that would prove crucial in the events to come. Intelligence reports had indicated potential threats, though nothing specific enough to cancel the event that had been planned for over a year. Morrison checked his equipment one final time, his fingers unconsciously moving to the various items secured to his belt. Among them was a standard-issue taser, part of the non-lethal arsenal that military police carried during public events. The device had been inspected and tested that morning, its yellow housing catching glints of sunlight as he moved. He had never used it in a ceremonial setting, never imagined he would need to. The parade marshal's voice crackled through loudspeakers, announcing the beginning of the ceremony. Military bands from various nations began playing in sequence, their melodies blending into a harmonious tribute to international friendship and cooperation. The crowd responded with applause and cheers, children waving small flags as the first units began their march. Thornfield felt the familiar surge of pride as his unit prepared to move. The Royal Guard had maintained their traditions for centuries, their presence at ceremonial events a symbol of continuity and service. His polished boots caught the rhythm as the band struck up the familiar march, and he began moving forward with his fellow guardsmen in perfect synchronization. The first hour of the parade proceeded flawlessly. Unit after unit marched past the reviewing stand, where dignitaries from multiple nations offered salutes and acknowledgments. Photographers captured the pageantry, and television crews broadcast the event to audiences around the world. The careful planning and preparation seemed to be paying off, with each element falling into place according to the detailed schedule. Morrison's unit had not yet begun their portion of the march, but he could observe the proceedings from his position near the staging area. He watched with professional interest as various international units demonstrated their precision and discipline. The Royal Guard, in particular, commanded attention with their distinctive uniforms and flawless execution of ceremonial movements. As the morning progressed, subtle changes began occurring that only trained observers would notice. Security personnel began speaking more frequently into their radio handsets, their expressions growing more serious with each exchange. Additional unmarked vehicles appeared at various points along the parade route, their occupants scanning the crowds with practiced eyes. The dignitaries in the reviewing stand seemed to be receiving more frequent updates from their security details. Thornfield remained focused on his duties, his attention fixed on maintaining perfect alignment with his fellow guardsmen. The weight of his ceremonial equipment was familiar and comfortable, each piece positioned exactly as regulations required. His rifle, though unloaded for the ceremonial function, was maintained to operational standards. His uniform bore the insignia of his rank and the various commendations he had earned during his years of service. The crowd's enthusiasm remained high, but experienced security personnel began noticing individuals who didn't quite fit the profile of typical spectators. These observers moved differently, their eyes scanning not the parade but the security arrangements themselves. Some carried communications equipment that seemed more sophisticated than typical civilian devices. Others positioned themselves at locations that offered clear sight lines to multiple potential exit routes. Morrison received a brief update through his earpiece, a routine communication that nevertheless carried an undertone of increased vigilance. Intelligence sources had identified several individuals of interest in the vicinity, though their specific intentions remained unclear. The decision had been made to proceed with the parade while implementing enhanced security measures that would be invisible to the general public. The coordination between various security agencies had been months in the making, with representatives from each participating nation contributing to the overall security plan. Communication protocols had been established, emergency procedures rehearsed, and contingency plans developed for various scenarios. However, no amount of planning could account for every possible variable in such a complex environment. As Thornfield's unit approached a key intersection in the parade route, the dynamics began to shift in ways that would prove significant. The crowd density increased at this location, with spectators pressed closer to the barriers that separated them from the marching units. Television crews had positioned themselves for optimal camera angles, their equipment creating additional obstacles for security personnel to navigate. Morrison's unit received orders to begin their advance toward the parade route, the timing carefully calculated to maintain the proper intervals between participating groups. His Marines fell into formation with practiced ease, their movements sharp and precise despite the ceremonial nature of the event. Each man carried himself with the bearing that marked him as a professional military serviceman. The intelligence reports that had been filtering in throughout the morning began to coalesce into a clearer picture of potential threats. While no specific attack had been identified, the presence of individuals with known connections to various extremist groups had been confirmed. Their purposes for attending the parade remained unclear, but their presence alone was enough to elevate the security status. Thornfield's training had prepared him for various scenarios, but the complexity of the current environment presented unique challenges. The presence of international military units, combined with the large civilian crowd and multiple security agencies, created a situation where clear command and control could become critical. His experience told him that something was developing, though the specific nature of the threat remained unclear. The parade marshal continued announcing each unit as it passed the reviewing stand, his voice maintaining the ceremonial tone appropriate for the occasion. Behind the scenes, however, communications had taken on a more urgent character. Security coordinators were tracking multiple potential concerns simultaneously, their attention divided between immediate crowd control and broader intelligence assessments. Morrison felt the familiar pre-deployment sensation, a heightened awareness that came from years of military experience. His senses seemed sharper, his attention to detail more acute. The faces in the crowd took on greater significance, and he found himself automatically cataloging potential threats and escape routes. This level of alertness was second nature to him, developed through training and combat experience. The Royal Guard continued their march with unwavering precision, their famous discipline on full display for the international audience. Thornfield took pride in representing not just his unit but his entire nation in this ceremonial role. The weight of tradition and responsibility was something he carried gladly, understanding that his performance reflected on institutions much larger than himself. As the morning sun climbed higher, the temperature began to rise, adding another variable to the complex equation that security personnel had to manage. Heat could affect crowd behavior, equipment performance, and individual judgment. While not extreme, the warming conditions served as a reminder that environmental factors could influence the outcome of events in unexpected ways. The intersection where the incident would soon occur had been identified in security planning as a potential choke point. The convergence of multiple streets, combined with the presence of several large buildings with multiple exits, created a complex environment that required careful monitoring. Additional personnel had been positioned in the area, though their presence was designed to be unobtrusive. Morrison's Marines were now moving into position for their portion of the parade, their boots striking the pavement in perfect unison. The sound of their movement added to the growing symphony of military precision that characterized the event. Each man was aware of his role not just in the immediate ceremony but in the broader diplomatic significance of the international gathering. The communications equipment that various security agencies carried began registering increased activity across multiple frequencies. While routine coordination continued, the volume and urgency of transmissions suggested that something significant was developing. Supervisors began positioning themselves for enhanced oversight, their experience telling them that the relatively calm morning might not continue. Thornfield could sense the subtle changes in atmosphere as his unit approached the critical intersection. Years of military service had taught him to read environmental cues that civilians might miss entirely. The positioning of security personnel, the behavior of the crowd, and the overall energy of the event all contributed to his assessment that conditions were evolving in ways that demanded increased vigilance. The reviewing stand continued to host dignitaries from the participating nations, their presence lending official weight to the ceremonial proceedings. However, their security details had quietly increased their protective postures, responding to intelligence updates that suggested elevated risk levels. These adjustments were made without disrupting the public ceremony, maintaining the balance between security and diplomacy that such events required. As Morrison's unit drew closer to their parade position, he conducted a final equipment check, his fingers moving automatically to verify that each item was properly secured and immediately accessible if needed. The taser on his belt represented one of several non-lethal options available to him, its presence a reminder that even ceremonial events could require rapid response to unexpected situations. The morning had begun with such promise, the international cooperation and display of military precision representing the best traditions of diplomatic engagement. However, beneath the surface pageantry, forces were beginning to align that would transform this peaceful gathering into something far more complex and dangerous. The stage was set for an incident that would test the preparedness and professionalism of everyone involved, from individual servicemen to the highest levels of government security apparatus. The critical moment began with what appeared to be a routine crowd control issue. A section of the barrier along the parade route had become unstable due to the pressing weight of enthusiastic spectators, and security personnel moved quickly to reinforce the area. This seemingly minor incident would prove to be the catalyst for a chain of events that no amount of planning could have anticipated. Thornfield's unit was executing a precision turn at the intersection when the first signs of trouble became apparent. A commotion in the crowd drew the attention of nearby security officers, who immediately began moving toward the disturbance. The nature of the problem wasn't immediately clear, but the rapid response of multiple agencies suggested that it was being treated as potentially serious. Morrison, still positioned with his unit awaiting their turn in the parade sequence, noticed the subtle shift in security posture almost immediately. His military training had taught him to recognize the signs of escalating situations, and the body language of the security personnel around him indicated that something significant was developing. His hand moved instinctively to his radio, ready to receive orders or updates. The individual who would later be identified as the primary catalyst for the incident had been under surveillance by multiple agencies throughout the morning. His presence at the parade had been noted, but his behavior had not crossed the threshold that would warrant immediate intervention. However, his position near the unstable barrier section provided him with an opportunity that intelligence services had not fully anticipated. Thornfield continued his ceremonial duties, maintaining perfect formation despite the growing activity around the parade route. His training emphasized the importance of continuing the mission unless specifically ordered to halt, and no such orders had been transmitted. The Royal Guard's reputation for unwavering discipline was built on exactly this type of professional commitment under challenging circumstances. The crowd's reaction to the developing situation became increasingly important as a factor in the overall security equation. While most spectators remained focused on the parade itself, others began noticing the increased movement of security personnel and the subtle changes in the atmosphere. Some began using their mobile phones to record what they perceived as unusual activity, inadvertently creating additional complications for security coordination. Morrison received his first specific intelligence update through his earpiece, a brief communication that nevertheless conveyed the seriousness of the evolving situation. Multiple agencies were tracking what appeared to be a coordinated effort by several individuals to exploit the crowd control challenges at the intersection. The nature of their intentions remained unclear, but the potential for disruption was significant enough to warrant elevated response protocols. The individual at the center of the developing crisis had carefully positioned himself to take advantage of the temporary weakness in the barrier system. His movements suggested familiarity with crowd control procedures and security protocols, indicating possible prior experience or training in such matters. Intelligence analysts would later determine that his selection of this particular location and timing was not coincidental. Thornfield's unit reached the midpoint of the intersection just as the situation began to escalate beyond routine crowd control measures. The unstable barrier section suddenly gave way completely, allowing several dozen spectators to spill onto the parade route directly in the path of the marching guardsmen. The immediate response of security personnel was swift and professional, but the complexity of the environment made coordination challenging. The breach of the security perimeter triggered multiple response protocols simultaneously. Local police moved to contain the crowd, event security worked to re-establish the barriers, and military security personnel began implementing procedures designed to protect the participating units. However, the convergence of these various responses in the confined space of the intersection created a complex and dynamic situation. Morrison's unit received orders to advance their position and prepare for possible deployment in a security role. The transition from ceremonial participants to active security assets was one that military units trained for regularly, but the international nature of the event added diplomatic complications to what might otherwise have been a straightforward tactical response. The individual who had been under surveillance chose this moment of confusion to make his move. Rather than attempting to approach the parade route himself, he began directing other spectators who had spilled through the barrier breach, using the chaos to mask his coordination efforts. His actions suggested experience in crowd manipulation and an understanding of how to exploit security vulnerabilities. Thornfield found himself at the center of the crisis as spectators moved around and between the members of his unit. Royal Guard protocols required maintaining formation and continuing the ceremonial function unless directly threatened, but the situation was rapidly moving beyond the parameters that such protocols were designed to address. His training emphasized discipline and restraint, but it also required him to assess threats and respond appropriately. The communications networks that connected various security agencies began experiencing strain as the volume of traffic increased dramatically. Multiple agencies were attempting to coordinate responses while maintaining their individual responsibilities, and the complexity of the command structure made unified action challenging. Intelligence was flowing in from multiple sources, but synthesizing it into actionable information required time that the rapidly developing situation did not provide. Morrison made the decision to move his unit forward based on the tactical assessment that additional security presence was needed at the intersection. His Marines were trained and equipped for crowd control operations, and their positioning allowed them to respond quickly to the developing crisis. However, the international diplomatic implications of American military personnel taking action in a foreign ceremonial event required careful consideration. The spectators who had breached the security perimeter were not uniformly hostile or threatening. Most were simply caught up in the confusion and trying to return to their designated viewing areas. However, the individual orchestrating the situation had managed to position several Confederates among the confused crowd, making it difficult for security personnel to distinguish between innocent bystanders and potential threats. Thornfield's assessment of the situation led him to conclude that his unit was being deliberately targeted by the coordinated group. Several individuals had positioned themselves to block the guardsmen's forward progress while others seemed to be attempting to separate individual guards from the main formation. This type of coordinated harassment was not unprecedented in ceremonial settings, but the scale and organization of the effort suggested more serious intentions. The decision to deploy non-lethal force measures was made at multiple levels simultaneously as the situation continued to escalate. Local police began using crowd control techniques to push spectators back toward the designated viewing areas, while military security personnel prepared to protect the participating units. The coordination of these efforts required real-time communication and split-second decision-making under pressure. Morrison's Marines reached the intersection perimeter just as the confrontation between Thornfield and the coordinated group reached its peak. The Royal Guard sergeant found himself surrounded by individuals who were clearly not innocent spectators, their movements too coordinated and their positioning too strategic to be coincidental. His options for response were limited by both ceremonial protocols and international diplomatic considerations. The individual directing the coordinated effort had positioned himself where he could observe the security response while maintaining plausible deniability about his own involvement. His understanding of crowd dynamics and security procedures allowed him to exploit the confusion while avoiding direct confrontation with law enforcement. However, his coordination efforts had not gone unnoticed by intelligence personnel monitoring the situation. Thornfield made the tactical decision to attempt to push through the coordinated group rather than wait for assistance that might not arrive in time. His movement triggered a response from the individuals surrounding him, who began using increasingly aggressive tactics to prevent his progress. The situation had clearly moved beyond ceremonial harassment into something more serious and potentially dangerous. The crowd's reaction to the developing confrontation became a factor that security agencies had to account for in their response planning. While most spectators were trying to distance themselves from the conflict, others were drawn toward it, either out of curiosity or to record the events with their mobile devices. This secondary crowd movement complicated efforts to contain the primary security breach. Morrison observed the confrontation involving Thornfield and made the immediate tactical assessment that intervention was necessary. The Royal Guard sergeant was clearly being targeted by a coordinated group, and his isolated position made him vulnerable to escalating violence. The decision to intervene required balancing immediate security needs against potential diplomatic complications. The individual orchestrating the coordinated effort recognized that the situation was approaching the point where law enforcement would be forced to take decisive action. His strategy had been to create enough disruption to accomplish his objectives while remaining below the threshold that would trigger major security responses. However, the courage and determination of Thornfield had complicated his planning. Thornfield's attempts to maintain his ceremonial posture while dealing with the increasingly aggressive group around him demonstrated the challenge of balancing competing requirements in a crisis situation. His training emphasized both military effectiveness and diplomatic sensitivity, but the current circumstances seemed to require choosing between these priorities. The communications systems connecting various security agencies registered a significant spike in activity as multiple supervisors attempted to coordinate responses to the rapidly developing situation. The complexity of the command structure, with representatives from multiple nations and agencies involved, made unified action challenging even under the best circumstances. Morrison's decision to intervene directly was based on his assessment that the situation had moved beyond crowd control into active threat response. His military training and experience provided clear guidance about when the use of force was justified, and the coordinated nature of the threat against Thornfield met those criteria. However, the international setting required him to consider implications beyond immediate tactical concerns. The moment of direct confrontation arrived when Thornfield attempted to push through the coordinated group and found his path blocked by individuals who were clearly prepared for physical confrontation. Their positioning and movements indicated training and preparation that went far beyond typical crowd control challenges. The situation had clearly escalated beyond ceremonial disruption into active threat engagement. The spectators in the immediate vicinity began reacting with alarm as the nature of the confrontation became apparent. While some moved away from the developing conflict, others pressed closer, creating additional complications for security personnel trying to respond effectively. The presence of international media crews meant that the developing situation was being broadcast in real time to audiences around the world. Morrison drew his taser as he moved toward the confrontation, his training dictating that non-lethal force was appropriate given the circumstances and the international diplomatic setting. The device represented one of several options available to him, but the crowded environment and the presence of innocent bystanders required careful consideration of its deployment. The individual directing the coordinated effort recognized that his operation was approaching failure and began implementing what appeared to be contingency plans designed to escalate the situation further. His actions suggested that disruption of the ceremonial event might not have been his primary objective, but rather a means to create conditions for some other purpose that remained unclear to observing security personnel. Thornfield's situation became increasingly precarious as the coordinated group intensified their efforts to isolate and overwhelm him. His ceremonial equipment, while impressive in appearance, was not designed for combat effectiveness, and his position in the middle of the intersection provided limited options for tactical response. The approaching assistance from Morrison represented his best opportunity for extracting himself from the developing crisis. The convergence of Morrison and Thornfield at the center of the intersection, surrounded by coordinated threats and confused spectators, represented the climax of a situation that had escalated far beyond anyone's initial expectations. The decisions made in the next few moments would determine not only the immediate outcome of the crisis but also its broader diplomatic and security implications for all the participating nations. The critical moment arrived with stunning suddenness. Morrison, approaching the chaotic scene where Thornfield was surrounded, found himself making split-second decisions based on incomplete information and rapidly changing tactical conditions. The coordinated group had succeeded in creating enough confusion that distinguishing between threats and innocent bystanders required instantaneous judgment calls that would have long-lasting consequences. Thornfield, pressed from multiple directions by individuals whose intentions had become increasingly clear, attempted to use his ceremonial rifle as a defensive tool to create space around himself. The movement was misinterpreted by Morrison, who was approaching from behind and could not see the full context of the Royal Guard's actions. In the chaotic environment, with multiple people moving aggressively around Thornfield, the raised rifle appeared to be an offensive gesture rather than a defensive one. The decision to deploy the taser happened in milliseconds, based on Morrison's training and experience in threat assessment. From his perspective, he observed what appeared to be an armed individual in military uniform threatening civilians in a crowded area during an international diplomatic event. The implications of allowing such a situation to escalate were severe enough that immediate intervention seemed not just appropriate but necessary. The electrical discharge from the taser struck Thornfield in the back, sending 50,000 volts through his body and causing immediate neuromuscular incapacitation. The Royal Guard sergeant collapsed instantly, his ceremonial rifle clattering to the pavement as his muscles seized and his balance failed completely. The distinctive sound of the taser firing and Thornfield's sudden collapse created a moment of stunned silence before chaos erupted around them. The coordinated group that had been surrounding Thornfield scattered immediately upon his collapse, their careful organization dissolving into apparent panic and confusion. However, their dispersal patterns suggested predetermined escape routes rather than random flight, indicating that they had planned for various contingencies including the intervention of additional security forces. Several individuals melted into the broader crowd so effectively that tracking them became immediately difficult. Morrison stood over the fallen Thornfield, his taser still in hand, as the full implications of his actions began to register. The Royal Guard's distinctive uniform and ceremonial equipment made it clear that this was not a civilian threat but rather a fellow military serviceman from an allied nation. The realization that he had just incapacitated a representative of one of America's closest allies during an international ceremony created a sinking feeling that went far beyond immediate tactical concerns. The crowd's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Spectators who had been recording the developing confrontation with their mobile devices now found themselves documenting an international incident of significant proportions. The distinctive uniform of the Tased Royal Guard was instantly recognizable to viewers around the world, and the implications of an American Marine using force against a British ceremonial soldier were immediately apparent even to casual observers. Thornfield lay motionless on the pavement, the effects of the electrical discharge having rendered him temporarily incapacitated but conscious. His training had not prepared him for being attacked by what he had assumed were Allied forces, and the shock of the situation was compounded by the physical effects of the taser. His ceremonial uniform, pristine moments before, was now disheveled and his bearskin cap had rolled several feet away from his prone form. The first security personnel to reach the scene faced the challenge of securing an area that contained both a potential international incident and ongoing threats from the coordinated group that had initiated the confrontation. Morrison remained standing over Thornfield, his weapon drawn but, his expression indicating growing awareness of the complexity of what had just occurred. The immediate tactical situation required crowd control and medical assessment, but the diplomatic implications demanded careful handling at the highest levels. Radio communications exploded across all security frequencies as word of the incident spread through the various agencies monitoring the parade. The involvement of military personnel from two allied nations transformed what might have been a routine crowd control situation into something requiring immediate attention from senior diplomatic and military officials. Emergency protocols designed for such contingencies were activated, but the specific circumstances of the incident strained existing procedures. The individual who had orchestrated the coordinated attack on Thornfield observed the aftermath of his operation from a position that provided clear sightlines while maintaining his cover as an ordinary spectator. His careful planning had succeeded in creating exactly the type of incident that could damage relationships between allied nations, though whether this had been his primary objective or a secondary benefit of some other goal remained unclear to the intelligence services tracking his activities. Morrison holstered his taser and knelt beside Thornfield, his military medical training taking over as he assessed the Royal Guard's condition. The effects of electrical discharge were temporary but could be serious depending on various factors including the individual's health condition and the specific circumstances of the deployment. His immediate priority shifted from threat response to providing assistance to a fellow serviceman who was clearly in distress. The parade itself ground to a halt as word of the incident reached the coordination center. The decision to suspend proceedings was made at the highest levels, with representatives from multiple nations consulting quickly about the appropriate response. The presence of international media meant that any action taken would be scrutinized by audiences around the world, making careful handling essential for diplomatic relations. Thornfield began to regain motor control as the immediate effects of the electrical discharge subsided. His first instinct was to attempt to return to his feet and resume his ceremonial duties, but the circumstances made it clear that the situation had moved far beyond normal ceremonial protocols. His training emphasized completing the mission regardless of personal difficulties, but the complexity of the current situation required different priorities. Emergency medical personnel reached the scene within minutes, their response time reflecting the comprehensive medical support that had been planned for the event. Thornfield's vital signs were checked and his condition assessed as stable but requiring observation for potential complications from the electrical discharge. The medical evaluation would become important not just for his immediate care but also for the official documentation of the incident. Morrison found himself at the center of a rapidly expanding circle of security personnel representing multiple agencies and nations. His actions, while taken in what he believed to be appropriate response to a threat, now required explanation and justification to officials whose primary concern was managing the diplomatic fallout from the incident. The complexity of the command structure meant that he would be questioned by representatives from several different organizations. The coordinated group that had initiated the confrontation had achieved their apparent objective of creating a significant international incident, but intelligence services were already beginning to piece together their identities and possible motivations. The sophistication of their planning and execution suggested resources and training that went beyond typical protest groups or random agitators, indicating possible state sponsorship or professional organization. Thornfield was helped to his feet by medical personnel, his dignity somewhat restored as his uniform was straightened and his equipment recovered. However, the incident had been recorded by dozens of spectators and multiple media outlets, ensuring that images of the Royal Guard's collapse would be broadcast around the world within hours. The visual impact of seeing a representative of the Queen's Guard incapacitated by an American Marine carried symbolic weight that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances. The investigation into the incident began immediately, with multiple agencies working to establish a clear timeline of events and identify all participants in the coordinated attack that had precipitated Morrison's intervention. The complexity of the situation, with dozens of potential witnesses and multiple surveillance systems recording different aspects of the confrontation, required careful coordination to ensure that all relevant evidence was preserved and analyzed. Morrison was escorted away from the immediate scene for debriefing by his superior officers and representatives from various intelligence agencies. His account of the events would be crucial for understanding the tactical decisions that led to the incident, but the diplomatic implications meant that his statements would be scrutinized at the highest levels of government. The career implications for a Marine who had tossed a royal guard during an international ceremony were potentially severe. The parade reviewing stand, where dignitaries from multiple nations had been observing the ceremonial proceedings, became the site of intense diplomatic consultation as officials attempted to craft appropriate responses to the developing crisis. The incident had occurred in full view of international representatives, making it impossible to manage the situation quietly or through normal diplomatic channels. Thornfield's condition continued to improve as the immediate effects of the electrical discharge faded, but the psychological impact of the incident remained significant. His training had prepared him for many challenging situations, but being attacked by what he had assumed were Allied forces during a peaceful ceremony created confusion that went beyond immediate physical effects. The trust between Allied military personnel had been damaged in a way that formal apologies might not be able to repair. The crowd control situation that had provided cover for the coordinated attack continued to require attention from security forces, but the focus had shifted from managing spectators to investigating the individuals who had orchestrated the confrontation. Intelligence analysts were working to determine whether the incident was an isolated event or part of a broader operation designed to damage relationships between Allied nations. Morrison's fellow Marines maintained their professional demeanor while dealing with the unprecedented situation of having one of their own involved in an international incident. Their training emphasized unit cohesion and mutual support, but the circumstances created challenges for maintaining both loyalty to their comrade and respect for their Allied counterparts. The diplomatic implications affected not just Morrison personally but his entire unit and the broader military relationship between the nations involved. The individual who had orchestrated the confrontation began implementing what appeared to be an extraction plan designed to remove him from the immediate area before security services could focus their attention on identifying the instigators of the incident. His movements suggested professional training in counter-surveillance and escape techniques, indicating that his involvement was not coincidental but rather part of a carefully planned operation. The media coverage of the incident began almost immediately, with news outlets around the world picking up the story of an American Marine tossing a royal guard during an international ceremony. The symbolic importance of the event, combined with dramatic visual evidence, ensured that the story would receive extensive coverage and analysis from political commentators and military experts. Thornfield's recovery process would extend beyond immediate medical concerns to include psychological evaluation and potential reassignment depending on his fitness for continued ceremonial duties. The incident had damaged not just his physical condition but also his confidence in the security arrangements that were supposed to protect ceremonial participants from exactly this type of situation. The investigation into the incident would eventually reveal the sophisticated nature of the operation that had been designed to create conflict between Allied military personnel. However, the immediate focus remained on managing the diplomatic fallout and ensuring that the relationship between the nations involved could survive the unprecedented breach of trust that had occurred during what was supposed to be a celebration of international cooperation and friendship. Within minutes of Thornfield's collapse, the carefully orchestrated response that had been planned for various emergency scenarios was set into motion. However, the specific nature of this crisis, an American serviceman using force against a British ally during an international ceremony, was unprecedented and strained existing protocols to their breaking point. Government security units from multiple nations converged on the scene with a coordination that was both impressive and somewhat chaotic. The first wave of responding security personnel consisted of diplomatic protection officers whose primary responsibility was safeguarding the international dignitaries observing the parade. Their arrival was swift and professional, but their mandate focused on evacuation and protection rather than investigation or crowd control. The sight of heavily armed officers moving through the crowd with tactical precision added a new dimension of tension to an already volatile situation. Morrison found himself surrounded by a diverse array of security officials representing different agencies and nationalities, each with their own protocols and priorities. American military police moved to secure their serviceman while British security services focused on protecting Thornfield and gathering initial intelligence about the attack. The coordination between these various agencies, while professionally executed, created a complex web of jurisdictions that would complicate the investigation for days to come. The intelligence services that had been monitoring potential threats throughout the morning suddenly found themselves dealing with an active crisis that threatened to overshadow their ongoing operations. The coordinated group that had attacked Thornfield had achieved their apparent objective of creating an international incident, but their success had also triggered a massive security response that would make their continued operations much more difficult. Thornfield, now conscious and alert despite his recent incapacitation, became the focus of intense attention from medical personnel and security officials. His account of the events leading up to Morrison's intervention would be crucial for understanding the tactical situation, but the diplomatic implications meant that his statements would be scrutinized at the highest levels of government. The Royal Guard's reputation for reliability and accuracy made his testimony particularly valuable. The crowd that had witnessed the incident presented both challenges and opportunities for the investigating agencies. While many spectators had recorded aspects of the confrontation with their mobile devices, providing potential evidence, their presence also complicated efforts to secure the scene and conduct detailed forensic analysis. The decision was made to establish a large perimeter around the incident site while systematically interviewing witnesses and collecting digital evidence. Morrison's commanding officers faced the immediate challenge of balancing support for their subordinate with the diplomatic requirements of the situation. His actions, while taken in apparent good faith based on his assessment of the tactical situation, had created an international incident that required careful handling at the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. The Marine Corps' reputation for taking care of its own was being tested against the broader strategic relationship between allied nations. The individual who had orchestrated the coordinated attack was experiencing the satisfaction of operational success while simultaneously implementing carefully planned extraction procedures. His positioning had allowed him to observe the immediate aftermath of the incident while maintaining his cover as an ordinary spectator. However, the massive security response was rapidly creating conditions that would make his continued presence in the area increasingly dangerous. Intelligence analysts working in real time began piecing together the sophisticated nature of the operation that had led to the confrontation. The coordination of the group that had surrounded Thornfield, combined with their effective disappearance after Morrison's intervention, suggested professional training and resources that went far beyond typical protest organizations. The implications of foreign intelligence involvement in an attack on ceremonial military personnel were severe enough to trigger additional security protocols. Thornfield's ceremonial equipment, scattered across the pavement during his collapse, was carefully collected and secured as potential evidence. Each item would be examined for fingerprints, DNA evidence, and other forensic clues that might help identify the individuals who had been in contact with the Royal Guard during the confrontation. The meticulous attention to detail reflected both investigative thoroughness and the high-profile nature of the incident. The parade route, which had been filled with thousands of spectators just minutes earlier, was now dominated by security personnel and emergency responders. The contrast between the festive atmosphere of the morning and the serious, professional demeanor of the crisis response highlighted the dramatic transformation that had occurred. International media crews found themselves documenting not a celebration of diplomatic friendship but a potential crisis in Allied relations. Morrison's fellow Marines maintained their disciplined formation despite the unprecedented circumstances surrounding their comrade. Their training emphasized unit cohesion and mutual support, but the international nature of the incident created unique challenges for maintaining both loyalty and diplomatic sensitivity. The visible presence of Allied security forces treating one of their own as a potential threat tested their professional restraint. The diplomatic protection officers responsible for the international dignitaries in the reviewing stand implemented evacuation procedures that had been rehearsed but never used in anger. The swift and efficient movement of high-ranking officials away from the potential threat area demonstrated the effectiveness of advance planning, but it also highlighted the serious nature of the security breach that had occurred during what was supposed to be a carefully controlled ceremonial event. The communications networks connecting various security agencies experienced their heaviest traffic since the planning phase of the event as reports, updates, and coordination messages flooded the systems. The complexity of managing multiple agencies, languages, and national interests in real time created challenges that tested even experienced crisis managers. Emergency protocols that had seemed comprehensive during planning exercises revealed gaps when applied to the specific circumstances of this incident. Thornfield's recovery continued under the watchful eyes of medical personnel from multiple nations, each ensuring that their interests were represented in his care. The international nature of the incident meant that his medical treatment became a matter of diplomatic significance, with representatives from various governments wanting to ensure that appropriate care was provided and properly documented. The investigation into the coordinated group that had precipitated the crisis began expanding beyond the immediate incident site as intelligence services shared information and resources. Facial recognition systems were employed to scan surveillance footage from the entire parade route, while communications intercepts were analyzed for patterns that might reveal the organization behind the attack. The sophistication of the operation suggested that this was not an isolated incident but, rather, part of a broader campaign. Morrison's legal situation became increasingly complex as representatives from multiple judicial systems attempted to determine jurisdiction and appropriate procedures for addressing his actions. The fact that he had acted as a representative of the American military while intervening in a situation involving British personnel during an international event created unprecedented challenges for legal authorities. Military justice systems, civilian courts, and diplomatic immunity considerations all potentially applied to different aspects of the case. The individual who had orchestrated the attack successfully extricated himself from the immediate area using predetermined routes and cover stories that had been prepared in advance. His professional training in counter-surveillance and escape techniques allowed him to avoid the expanding security net, but intelligence services were already beginning to piece together his identity through analysis of surveillance footage and witness accounts. The media coverage of the incident exploded across international news networks as the dramatic footage of an American Marine tossing a Royal Guard spread around the world. The symbolic importance of the confrontation, representing a breakdown in trust between traditionally allied forces, provided compelling content for news organizations and political commentators. The visual impact of Thornfield's collapse in his distinctive ceremonial uniform created images that would be replayed countless times in the coming days. Government security units continued arriving at the scene throughout the afternoon as the scope of the investigation expanded. Counterintelligence specialists, diplomatic security officers, and senior military officials from multiple nations converged on the incident site, each bringing their own priorities and perspectives to the crisis management effort. The coordination of these diverse agencies required careful attention to both operational effectiveness and diplomatic sensitivity. Thornfield's condition stabilized completely as the effects of the electrical discharge faded, but the psychological impact of the incident remained significant. His trust in the security arrangements that were supposed to protect ceremonial participants had been fundamentally shaken, and his confidence in Allied cooperation had been damaged in ways that might take considerable time to repair. The Royal Guard's emphasis on tradition and reliability made the breach of protocol particularly difficult to process. The forensic investigation of the incident site revealed the sophisticated nature of the operation that had been conducted against Thornfield. The coordinated positioning of the attacking group, their effective communication during the confrontation, and their rapid dispersal afterward all indicated professional training and resources. Intelligence analysts concluded that the attack had been designed specifically to create conflict between Allied military personnel rather than to achieve any immediate tactical objective. Morrison's debriefing process extended through multiple sessions with representatives from various agencies and military commands. His account of the tactical decisions that led to his intervention provided valuable insight into the confusion and time pressure that characterized the incident, but it also highlighted the challenges of operating in complex international environments where split-second decisions could have far-reaching diplomatic consequences. The investigation ultimately revealed that the coordinated attack on Thornfield had been orchestrated by a foreign intelligence service as part of a broader operation designed to damage relationships between allied nations. The sophistication of the planning and execution, combined with the careful selection of targets and timing, demonstrated the evolving nature of international threats in an era where symbolic actions could have strategic impact. The long-term consequences of the incident would extend far beyond the immediate crisis management efforts. New protocols would be developed for protecting ceremonial military personnel during international events, while intelligence sharing between allied services would be enhanced to better identify and counter similar operations in the future. The relationship between Morrison and Thornfield, two professional servicemen caught in circumstances beyond their control, would eventually be repaired through careful diplomatic efforts and mutual understanding of the complex situation they had both faced. The parade that had begun as a celebration of international cooperation and shared values had been transformed into a demonstration of the challenges facing allied nations in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. However, the professional response of security services from multiple countries, and their effective coordination in managing the crisis, also illustrated the strength of the relationships that potential adversaries had sought to damage. The incident would be remembered not just for the dramatic confrontation between Allied servicemen, but also for the demonstration of international cooperation in the face of sophisticated threats to diplomatic stability.